All right. All right. Good morning, everyone. It is September 2nd. Um, this is one of the series of the National Council on U.S.-Libya Relations webinars that we conduct. It is a special um, event or a special webinar because it happens to be 1 year after the Daniel storm hit the city of Derna. And the questions we pose today is a year after the Daniel Storm tragedy, what does the future hold for the city and for Libya? Derna is a quaint city in the southern shore of the Mediterranean, and it suffered a catastrophic flood that destroyed over 20,000 uh, inhabitants lost in that event on September 9th, 2023. And the tragedy was seen as a result of a combination of 50 years of decay of its infrastructure, including outdated and poorly maintained dams and a series of human errors, despite numerous public pleas and scientific reports which called for urgent repair of the structurally faulted dams. This led to the collapse of the dams, which were, in many opinions, avoidable and has cost many, many lives. The immediate response of the locals and the nationals in Libya from all over the walks of Libya, east, west, and south, was compassionate and raised the hope that the country could actually be united and that they would all dismiss their disagreements. The goodwill, however, did not last long, and the divisions between the East and West governments reemerged. The international community's response to the crisis at that time was timid, slow, and mediocre at best. It was disorganized and mostly lacked coordination and strategy. Most of the real work, despite financial restrictions and lack of experience and structure, came from the Libyan National Army, which is run by the strongman Haftar and his sons, now de facto the ruling dynasty in the east and much of the south of Libya. Divisions and bickering between Prime Minister Dbeibeh, the internationally recognized government of the so-called National Unity in Tripoli, and the nationally recognized Hamad government appointed by the internationally recognized House of Representatives in the East, but not completely legitimized by the State Council in the West, made for a very confusing milieu. And the salvage efforts for the city were basically confusing and disorganized. Efforts to build the ways of life and reconstruct the destroyed city of Derna thereafter became the exclusive responsibility of the Derna and Mountain Reconstruction Authority, run by Belgassab Haftar and his associates. Skepticism of how it would be possible for this authority to succeed under harsh restrictive finances, a result of Dbeibeh starving the East from the central bank money, somehow evolved to release of funds by the governor of the central bank, Sadiq al-Kabir, and possibly UAE money and Egyptian manpower. It is now almost a year since the flood. Today, we have with us a group of serious Libya experts and not the occasional Occidentals. We have Claudia Casini, who is the senior scholar in the crisis group responsible for Libya, who has studied, published extensively on Libya, and landed a role as a political advisor to Hassan Salama at the UN Special Envoy of Libya and head of its mission there. She writes and speaks out of detailed knowledge of the intricacies of the political, economic, and security of Libya. She frequents Libya and has an ability to reach out and explore different levels of opinion on the country. We also have with us another intellectual and scholar who not only studied Libya during the PhD years in England, but also frequented Libya, wrote and spoke extensively about Libya, advised committees in UK, US, and Europe to help understand the Libyan complex political, security, and financial puzzles. He was the executive director of the US Libya Business Council and author of the book Libya and the Global Enduring Disorder. Jason Pack currently is the editor of Ordering the Disorder, an insightful literature and podcast dissecting the genealogy and products of current global disorder. And he's also the founder of Libya Analysis. He's also a senior analyst at the NATO Defense College Foundation. We have with us also Professor Faraj Najm, who is a native of Benghazi. He studied management and international relations in UK and obtained his PhD in political sociology in London, and then became director of the academic research at Grafton College, and he is on the board of Libyan Studies at the British Academy in London. He is currently a faculty member of the Department of Management at the University of Benghazi and at the International Medical University as well. He is also the director of the Salam Center for Peace Building and Crisis Management in Libya. Finally, I have the privilege of having with me today two of our distinguished National Council on U.S.-Libya Relations board members, Dr. Hassan Sassi, who is the Vice President of the Council, a retired professor of structural and civil engineering, who also happens to be born and raised in the city of Derna, and has recently returned from visiting the city and inspecting its structural and societal damage. He will share with us his personal thoughts on the city and its needs. And last but not least, Wolfgang Puchtai, who is the chair of the advisory board of the National Council, and he does not need an introduction. He was the defense attaché at the Austrian embassy in Libya, as well as positions in Italy, Greece, Tunisia, and others. He was in Libya during the 2011 revolution and has followed in detail its complex security issues. He has witnessed and continued to study the details of Libya on a 24/7 basis. He ascends the rank of Austrian army. He's in the Austrian defense. He has both military and political science degrees from the University of Vienna and a master's degree from the War College in Washington, D.C. They're all here today to discuss Derna, 1 year after the tragic 9/11 flood, where things stand today from different aspects: humanitarian, reconstruction, security, and others. So I welcome them all, and I will start by posing questions. It will be more of a conversation. I will start with Claudia Gazzini. Claudia, you've been in Libya. Libya is part and parcel of your expertise portfolio. You've studied it in detail. You've written about it and have visited it frequently, including a few visits over the last few months. Can you share with us your observations on the city of Derna a year ago and now? Can you tell us about the construction, the people, how they are governed, and their level of satisfaction? Claudia?
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this event, and thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to discuss this topic, which is still a very sad topic for me. I was in Derna 4 times this year, immediately after the floods, in October, November, in February, March, and then just 2 weeks ago. I've seen a city change a lot. Mind you, I was in Derna also before the floods, just July before the flood. So I've seen the whole sort of evolution of the city over the past year. When I arrived in Derna after the floods, it was a devastated city center. I mean, there's always this strange feeling when you go to Derna, which is to see the devastation in a very narrowed and restricted area, which is the downtown city center, whereas the east and the west side of the cities, it's business as usual, and most houses are perfectly intact. But the devastation of that wadi and the buildings around there is just, I mean, you've all seen the photos. It's just, still terribly saddening, but also unbelievable that this mass of water could have destroyed just within 1 hour so many buildings and taken away so many lives. What I've seen since last September is really remarkable. I mean, I was one of those who after the devastation and after the flooding, said, we really need the two governments to come together to be able to have reconstruction here, to be able to move things forward. And I was surprised to see in my last visit that there's so much reconstruction happening, actually, beyond what I could have imagined. So there are apartment blocks coming up, not just the Korean blocks, the Korean apartments, which is this sort of neighborhood out of the city, which was an old Gaddafi era project, but apartment blocks that are coming up along the coast and also in the city center in part of the devastated area. There are bridges, at least 2, I counted, that are being built across the Wadi. Remember, all 6 bridges over the valley of Derna were destroyed. What I didn't see was any intervention or thinking or planning around the dams. So I visited Wadi Bou Mansour Dam again for the 3rd time this time, and it remains this huge destroyed dam, completely gutted, without any particular work taking place around there. What I didn't see and what I didn't get a sense of, which I would have liked to see, was a sense of what all of this means. Like, where is the master plan? What is the Wadi going to look like? Where are the safety procedures? What's the thinking? What's the engineering behind those constructions that are coming up? How is the water flow from the Wadi Derna and Wadi Budahak, which is the reason of the crisis in the first place? How is that going to be channeled? So I was a bit surprised to see that there's all this construction happening, including of bridges over this Wadi, without having a clear master plan. At least I was not conveyed to me. Dam experts tell me that after a tragedy of this sort, the usual procedure is to wait for a proper assessment of, first of all, the reasons for the destruction of the dam, why it collapsed. And we still don't have a real proper scientific engineering investigation with conclusions as to what actually went wrong, right? I mean, Hani, even you, in your opening remarks, you said, we think this and we think that, but actually this is what engineers are there for, to do also a forensic report of what went wrong in that dam collapse event. Because you build on that knowledge to then start programming what you do next, yeah? And so I came away from my last visit happy to see all this reconstruction happening, amazed by it, to be honest, but a little concerned that the due diligence that should be put in building projects of this sort in such a problematic location hasn't been put in. As for the funding, because just one last remark, you mentioned in your remarks, Hani, that the political splits have led the central bank not to fund the reconstruction in the East, actually, and you made some strong remarks against the international community. So I would like to weigh in those 2 points. First of all, I mean, the presence of the international community immediately after the destruction was just sort of civil protection intervention. They were there to possibly find survivors, right? So it was a 2-week mission of a number of countries. I saw Russians, I saw Tunisians, Algerians, Italians, French, Egyptians, and it was like first emergency. So they were there, and actually they were really well coordinated. It was a Turkish coordination, and the city was divided in areas of competence of the various countries. They disappeared after the rescue period was ended, and that's normal procedure because they are civil protection agencies of the various countries. Where the international community has been absent is in the reconstruction phase, not because of lack of coordination or lack of will. I mean, the UN and the UN agencies have been there, working on sanitation, on kids project and so on, and they have been helping. The World Bank did a great assessment of the damage of those floodings. It's a comprehensive report of all the damage in the East that occurred after that flood, Daniel, and that is an important sort of legacy. the international community also offered to sort of help coordinate the reconstruction, but the Libyan parties at some point said thanks, but no thanks. This is because it's easier to handle reconstruction money if it comes from your own pockets and if it's the managers, the Libyan managers themselves doing it without having to have international oversight. As far as I'm aware, a lot of the money for the reconstruction, yes, probably has come from Eastern funds or allied funds. But we also know, and this is black on white because it's in the central bank statements, the last expenditure statement, that 950, if I'm not mistaken, $1 million was transferred to the East for reconstruction in the first half of 2024. So I'm guessing that part of that bulk sum, because that's all we know, it says bulk sum 950 million for reconstruction in the East, has probably gone towards that Derna reconstruction.
Thank you. Well, Claudia, I mean, just for the early phases of the salvage of Derna, I was there from the first week in Derna, in the streets, in the hospitals, and I saw that the lack of coordination was present from day one. And I don't really blame the international community for not being there. They were there. Donations were made. But they did not anticipate the lack of the capabilities of the recipients. I mean, they had walked in as if they were walking into Turkey or another disaster area in a sort of a more structured country. What they were surprised with is that there were no receivers. So you would see that tons of supplies, medicine, and so on would be coming in, but they would coming into a vacuum. They were just basically throwing in tons and tons of supplies into storage places. And because of the failure of the government and the governance in Libya from 2011 until now, there were no pharmacists, inventory managers, and things like that, to the extent that trucks were going around the city and throwing supplies to the people in the streets. When you wanted to find something, you couldn't find it. If you had a specific drug or something, you couldn't find it because there was no delivery and receipt and process in there. So it made it more difficult. And the blame is really not on the amount of donations or the capability of donors, but is actually in the lack of understanding and the inability to comprehend that there were no proper recipients on the other side. So that led to a sort of a chaotic situation in there. But now we're moving on. I think the people and the inhabitants of Derna kind of settled slowly into the realities of the city. They're looking at the constructions and so on. There's a lot of questions that you actually brought up, Claudia, which has to do with where's the map? Where is the print of where are we going with all this? There are questions about accountability. And now recently there was a trial in Derna in which 12 officials were sentenced for negligence related to the breaking of the dams and so on. Have you followed this? Can you tell us about it?
Sure. Yes, I followed the trial. I was there for the first session of the trial and followed the subsequent sessions and have read the final verdict, the 64-page verdict. And first of all, I do not like, in general, again, I'm told, for infrastructural tragedies of this sort, the usual procedure is not to start a trial until there's an expert report, okay? This is a case for all the other dam disasters in the world, I am told. So you have the experts come in, do their analysis, go to the valleys, and come up with a report of what they think happened. And then normally, then the criminal trial starts. Libya didn't do that, okay? So there is a task force of experts that several countries, I think the Dutch, the EU, the UN, and the World Bank sort of tasked to put together a report. The report is almost finalized. It shall be published, but it hasn't been published, right? So de facto today, the Libyan authorities themselves, including the prosecutor, don't really have an expert report saying where they think the problems were. So they've gone straight to trial. Okay, so this is the first problem. Second problem is the sentencing and who they put to trial, because they've lumped together sort of a group of individuals involved in financing Derna over the few years. So the former governor of the central bank Benghazi branch, Ali Hibri, and several others that worked with him to finance reconstruction in Derna after the war against Daesh, and accuse them of embezzlement or mismanagement of funds. Now, that could very well be. I mean, I don't know if there actually was embezzlement, but the point is that has nothing to do with the dam failure. This group of 4 or 5 people had no authority, didn't even spend a penny, didn't even know probably that there were problems with the Derna Dam back then. So putting these people into that criminal trial for me is very problematic, and they're the ones that have been served harsh sentences. Then there's another group of people accused and brought to trial, which are the engineers or water ministry department officials, again accused of negligence. They, from what I know, and I've interviewed some of them, they say that they reported that this dam was failing, but it hadn't been functioning since the 1980s. But you know Libya, you know that the low-level engineer in a ministry is not the one that decides whether or not a reconstruction project happens. And then especially is a city where over the years we've had the revolution in 2011. Then we've had ISIS and ongoing war between 2014 and 2018. And only after 2020, things were starting to go back to normal. So the fact that the engineers of the water ministry didn't sort of do anything or didn't renovate or push for the earmarked works is not necessarily the responsibility of these individuals. So this is my remark about the case. And then the procedures, as far as I'm told from some of the lawyers, they had the sessions were held without being able to bring in witness experts, without being able to really hear those accused, without really being able to have a debate, right? As we imagine it's normally a trial. So for me, it's a problematic trial.
So there is an element of mediocrity in that judicial process, and it almost begs to be described as a symbolic gesture. Perhaps people wanted and were looking forward to some sort of a reprimand or addressing those things. It was done in this way with all the deficits that you actually described. But there are still a lot of questions. There's a lot of further details that needed to be brought up. And it's almost felt that they just wanted to, close it and just move on rather than actually do a proper job in investigating and so on. I'm going to ask Faraj, who is from Benghazi. He frequents their Matan. Faraj, you witnessed several conflicts in the East. You witnessed the Karama in Benghazi. You witnessed what happened in Derna against the Daesh and so on. Can you describe to us the past and the current mode of people in the streets and how it has changed, if any? Is this something positive? Are people in the streets and so on cheering or critical, or what exactly is the mood in the streets in Benghazi and in Derna and in the Matan, particularly in relation to the construction and what they're seeing in the streets today? Faraj?
Thank you very much. Well, the mood in Benghazi and Derna is a mood of delight, of change. Don't forget that this part of Libya has suffered badly, either at the hands of Islamists, extreme Islamists, or the worst was ISIS, Daesh, in Benghazi and Derna. And there were big fights between the National Army, backed by the people, either Benghazi or much of Cyrenaica, and against those rogue elements. And since the liberation, people have relieved a sigh of relief, and the things have moved on. But recently, things have changed dramatically. We are not accustomed to such big development plans and reconstruction projects, especially by the military or under the auspices of the military. We've been told by the opposition, by the other, if you like, the other bank of the political ping pong, that the military are no good and you should get rid of them. And that's why we got rid of Gaddafi and why we are supporting Haftar now. But to the ordinary man and the street and woman, they're seeing things are changing. I mean, for instance, if I just give you some of the projects which are being carried out. I mean, Derna is, again, I can't speak for the people of Derna, but I speak regularly with friends there who have expressed their surprise, their joy over what's happening in Derna. To the extent, one of them, he said, what's happening in Derna actually has made us more or less forget what we have suffered over the last year. Derna is being transferred. Derna is becoming back again as a beautiful Mediterranean city. Big projects, I mean, they are taking place in Derna. And Derna is what's living right now. It has not seen for the last, I would say, 50 or even 60 years. So Derna is going to be a completely different city. Sadly, we have lost our loved ones who will be with us to celebrate the accomplishment. But nonetheless, Derna is coming back alive, is coming back very strongly, and the civil identity, the cultural identity that has always colored Derna is coming back. In Benghazi, again, it's the seat of power where the National Army is and the parliament, but also the government is witnessing some mega projects like, for example, they're building a new electric plant, they are building a steel plant, they're building a cement plant, they are building a huge airport, which is going to be one of the biggest in North Africa, at least. They just handed over the free zone to one of the biggest UAE investors, Al-Abbar, the so-called, I think they called global builders. The port is now being negotiated or handed over, I believe, to AD Ports from Abu Dhabi as one of the biggest BOTs. Now Benghazi has one of the biggest private airlines, Barnik, which has the biggest fleet in Libya. They've got 6 airplanes and they've just signed contracts in Britain to buy another 6 brand airplanes. So there are lots of projects. They're going to the desert. They are revisiting the so-called green zones, whereby these farms which have been neglected by the previous regime, by Gaddafi's regime. Now it's coming back. They're investing. They're pouring money into it. I believe some American companies are joining the fray there. And it's the reconstruction and the development and this sense of joy and happiness. It's not just extended to Benghazi and Derna. It's going beyond. It's going to Tobruk, to Bayda, Al-Merj, but also it's going to Sirt now totally, and to Sabha, to Murzig, to other places that's dominated by the NLA. So the feeling in the street, it's a feeling of joy, and I hope this will last. But also a feeling of job creation. I mean, for instance, now there are lots of Darnawis are working in those companies. Actually, some of the Benghazinos are getting jealous because many of the companies in Benghazi are going to work there in Derna, and they are already there. I know, for instance, Barga, one of the biggest construction holding, has left its operation here in Benghazi to build 5,000 housing units. and they are currently building 2,700 in Derna and 2,000 in Gupta, where Agila Saleh is. And now speaking to the chairman of the company, and he said we've been asked not just to hand empty, beautiful flats, big flats, 3-bedroom and 2 bathrooms and kitchen and sitting room and so on, but they have to be fully furnished. So you're talking about a special treatment for Derna, but also for other places. If you speak to people in Sirt, they say Sirt has come back since the destruction that has seen since 2011. Roads are being built. Generally speaking, the mood's good. I mean, there are about 36 bridges being built in Benghazi, in Derna, Sirt, Sabha, Jdabiya, Al-Bayda, and Tobruk, and so on and so forth, and many other roads. There are thousands of kilometers of roads have been paved. When you say roads, some might take this for granted and they might laugh. But to us, this is a necessity, not a luxury, because we have not had this for the last, I would say, 20, 30 years. So things are, it's getting better.
I want to ask you, and perhaps weigh others on this whole thing. It seems that people in the are sort of comfortable with the sense of security that they have, but there are some breaches also in the security. Hear about people that are pulled out from their homes and investigated, put in prison. We've heard about the recent release of 4 of the political activists in there. But then you are also saying that people are with the progress that is made in the cities. They seem to be pleased with it. What do they say about lack of transparency that, for example, Claudia brought in, or the other sort of liberties that many of the opposition to the military autocracy say that, we did get rid of Gaddafi, and now we have a military family again ruling. And the reason I want to bring the others in on this one too is the reality is the Middle East is loaded with examples of dynasties that rule. You take it from the Gulf to Egypt and others. It's either sort of some form of autocracy or another. Is this something that we are basically slowly moving on towards, and the people in Libya are willing to accept that the production of dynasties without basically too much attention to democracies, or at least Western democracies, as they are perceived and advocated by the West? I'm going to ask you this, and I'm also want to have Jason also engage in this, because it kind of swings us towards this global disorder and how things are shaping in different parts of the world. So Faraj, and then Jason, I would like you to comment on this, please.
Well, for pedantics like me who would ask these questions, where does the money come from? What are the procedures? And where is the so-called audit bureau and so on? But to the ordinary man in the street, they wouldn't ask these questions. Don't forget that Libya has been living in chaos for the last 12 years. So to them, this is something that a gift came from God, and they are so happy. And also we've seen and we've detected an apathy in the Libyan streets. People are no longer concerned with things like elections and so-called democracy and so on, because don't forget that those politicians that we have and we are stuck with, they were democratically elected. Agila Saleh was democratically elected, and the others. So to the ordinary man in the street, to them, it's improved my life, and forget about the rest. I'm not concerned. I remember one a diplomat came and asked me, and he said, "Where did you get the money from?" And I said, "We steal it. None of your business. Did we take it from you? It's our money, and we are, we do whatever with it, as long as we do something for the people." And If you ask anyone in Derna and you say, would you ask where the money came from? They will say no. As long as it's done for our benefit and the city is being reconstructed, so we can go back and live in our homes as decent human beings. So the question isn't a priority in the Libyan street. It's what's priority. It's can you deliver? Can you do it? And apparently these guys are doing it. They're doing it. I mean, people are watching it. We are not, we're not just, we're not being told. We see it. We live it.
I see. Thank you. Jason, do you want to jump on this and comment, please?
I'd like to, yes. So firstly, thanks Faraj and Claudia. Very insightful remarks. What I would say is just the takeaway for me is that both the Derna tragedy happened because of a business usual approach, and the response to it has been a business as usual approach. What is the takeaway? I think it's exactly what Faraj has said. We're not only moving towards quote unquote apathy, which has prevailed in Libya for 10 years or more, but rather it's been proven that if a humanitarian crisis at the extent of the Derna flood, which was the largest loss of life in a 24-hour period in independent Libya's history, far greater than anything that happened in the Libyan-Chadian war or in the 2011 uprisings, if that's not sufficient to get the international community on the same page to have coherent policy towards Libya, then it is therefore not surprising that some crisis over the central bank governance is also not going to cause a coherence of international approach. And the meaning of that also applies inside Libya. There was hope briefly in late September, October 2023. Oh, maybe this will have shown the extent of the corruption and incompetence in a way that transcends East and West, and there'll be kind of united street protests, and then there'll be pressure to, oust Dubaiba or Haftar or whatever. And I said, no, that's never going to happen. It's not a question of extent of humanitarian suffering. There are structural reasons why it's not possible to have a mass movement of that kind, having to do with who has the guns and who has the organization. So we're in a situation now where it's very clear it doesn't matter the extent of the humanitarian tragedy that might emerge, say, from Libya not being able to import petrol, which could be an implication of the current crisis, or food prices increasing. We're not going to see that human tragedy pivoting towards unified collective action on either the international or domestic levels. That's my takeaway from what I've heard from Claudia and Faraj that I very much agree with.
So since you brought up the issue of the Libyan bank, and there are many in the audience who do not really understand the details of how the central bank authority has evolved, its relations with the East and West, can you describe to the audience here today how it worked, how it has evolved, and the rivalry between East and West, and how Al-Kabir navigated his way, and what the current status is? Last week has been really problematic, and I would ask you to, describe it and also weigh in as your opinion as to where that is heading. Right.
I mean, as you had alluded, in a way that would be a whole separate panel, so I'm going to try to constrain my remarks here. I have written extensively about the Libyan economy as being comprised of semi-sovereign institutions. The most semi-sovereign of those institutions is the central bank. We need to keep in mind that the Skhirat Treaty, otherwise known as the Libyan Political Agreement of December 2015, considers the central bank sovereign. I think that that's a misuse of words, both in the English and the Arabic of that treaty, but let's call it semi-sovereign. What does that mean? It is an institution like the Office of Development of Administrative Centers or the Housing and Infrastructure Board or LIPTIC or GCAL, which acts independently in this semi-sovereign capacity from government authority, be it Eastern or Western or unified government authority. That semi-sovereignty allows and has allowed the CBL to give money, withhold money, give letters of credit, withhold letters of credit separately from government demands. A critical thing that happened with the bifurcation of Libyan governance in 2014 was that the central bank continued to pay salaries in both East and West and continued to pay salaries to rogue military actors, even though they were not officially on the Libyan state's payroll. This decision is what allowed the second war of post-Gaddafi succession to continue, the payment of both sides of the conflict by the central bank. This continued into the 2019-2020 war for Tripoli. There was an extent to which both sides in that war were being paid for by the central bank. And when that war was settled in June of 2020, part of the ceasefire in October 2020 was that the bad debt issued by Eastern commercial banks in connivance with the Eastern Central Bank would be absorbed by the real central bank. So there was a situation whereby actors who had fought to overthrow Kabir were having their bad debts paid for by Kabir as part of the settlement of the war. You would have thought from that point onward that, okay, Kabir was willing to assume this bad debt and to pay Eastern salaries, but he was on the side of the West. There has been a process over the last 4 years where, although when Dbeibeh came into office, Dbeibeh and Kabir had a much better relationship than he had had with Siraj or with Zaidan, there's been a process of falling out between Dbeibeh and Kabir. Even though they have similar Misratan and business elite connections going back to the Gaddafi period, Dbeibeh asked too much of Kabir. He asked for a lot of infrastructure programs, the supposed reviving life program, but then also just handouts and marriage payments and other essentially bribes for the Libyan people to be paid for. And when the time came for another devaluation, as had happened at the end of the Siraj period, Dbeibeh opposed that devaluation, and he opposed the Forex tax of the kind that was done also in the late Siraj period. This put them on a collision course. So the GNU and Dbeibeh and the PC opposing what Kabir wanted to do and the Libyan economy demanded, which is this Forex tax in lieu of a devaluation, because you need a board meeting of the CBL to have an actual devaluation. What is interesting that has evolved over the last 18 months is the extent to which the East, Aguila Saleh, and particularly Haftar and his sons, were willing to embrace this Forex tax and to flip Kabir from his position of working with Tripoli and various Misratan militias over the last 10 years to working with the East and being willing to underwrite Eastern spending. Since that has happened, over the last year, we have seen a way in which Kabir is willing to underwrite the spending of the kind that we've just heard about from Faraj Najm. In other words, Eastern spending and Eastern corruption, and deals with Saddam Haftar and Bilqasim Haftar and the Reconstruction Fund and the MIA, the military sovereign wealth bit of the LNA, the MIA. And therefore, Kabir, although operating in Tripoli, has offended most of the militias and political powers in Tripoli and Misrata, other than Rada, which were nominally keeping him safe. But what happened over the last few weeks is a deal was cut whereby Rada would allow other militias to take Kabir out of the bank and would no longer guarantee his security. That, as it was coming into being, allowed the PC and Dbeibeh to issue this bizarre decree, which goes against Article 15 of the Skhirat arrangements, of the Skhirat agreement, saying that, Kabir is not the central bank governor. They tried to make it seem like the East and other power brokers were on board by choosing Mohammed Shukri, who in 2017 the HOR had appointed, but they'd long since rescinded that appointment. So it's not like the moves that they've done pass the Article 15 smell test. They don't. These are simply the use of force to, upend consensus. I am not a believer that Kabir should stay in his position, but he certainly shouldn't go in this way. I have long called for changing the relationship between the semi-sovereignty of the CBL and the international community. I would argue that these institutions shouldn't have been sovereign and that the international community should not have granted them this semi-sovereignty. But where we are now is a kind of free-for-all where might is making right, and might has been used to force Kabir and his team out of power. But interestingly, the new people who are being imposed and put in the building, they don't have access to the correct codes, not only the SWIFT codes, but the other codes which are needed to make wires. So we have a complete dysfunction whereby neither is there coherent policy at the international level, neither is there coherent policy at the Libyan level. And this is, to my mind, the implications of the fact that the many wars of post-Gaddafi succession from 2011 to 2014 to 2019 and 2020 have been fought over control of the central bank. And now this desire to have control of the central bank has reached to the point whereby alliances have been reshuffled between power players and militias to physically take control of the building. But physically taking control of the building doesn't give you the ability to use the SWIFT codes and to work with the international players, such as the US Department of Treasury, which are needed to make the system work and to prevent JP Morgan doing de-risking or the Bank of England issuing more de-risking advice. So we don't know how that will play out. I mean, it is a shambles. I could speak more, but I think that that's a reasonable overview before we go further.
This is exactly what the situation is in Libya. It's almost as if the central bank is frozen, and they have released the salaries for the month of August simply because it was already released, but they're heading now to September. How are they going to be getting the money? They're basically leaning towards asking the private banks to cough up that money as loans and guarantees. But as you have mentioned, it's a totally chaotic situation, and Stephanie Khoury has been trying to salvage the situation, but there isn't any very clear indicators as to how the negotiations that she is calling for are going to lead to a sort of a unified consensus on how the governance of the central bank is going to be. And you brought up the issue of the militias and the shift in loyalties to the central bank, which I would assume that has to do with the funding. You give out, they are loyal, you hold off, and they are anti. I'm going to bring Wolfgang here a little bit because we need to get the sense of the details of what is happening in the streets in Tripoli, in the rest of the country. You have always brought up a sort of a current map of the militias and how they are acting and their affiliations. Wolfgang, from 2009 when you started in there up until now, and I don't want to give the whole history, but can you give us a sort of a brief as to what the current situation is vis-a-vis the powers on the streets of Tripoli being the capital, and how in many ways and with serendipity there is an impact or will be an impact on the central bank as well as the funding of the city of Derna and the east, as well as the future of Debeba and the government west.
Sure. Let me at first, as an Austrian and country which has numerous dams in our Alps, to mention that every dam has a breaking point. And I'm sure Hassan will agree with me, every dam has a breaking point. The amount of water in Derna last September was several times the combined capacity of both dams. There was no way that they remain intact, even if they would have been in the very best condition. The key mistake was that a much earlier evacuation would have been required. And this was the major mistake. I agree with Claudia that they should have investigated this before. What could be done? Probably, and Hassan is certainly in a better capacity to find an answer to this, but probably a system of dams and pipelines is needed in the upper part of the body, and in particular an early warning system. Who could maintain this? And this brings me to the militias. I strongly argue and advise the Libyans to find a secondary role for the many militias with regard to disaster relief, with regard to taking care of preparations to avoid disasters, for maintaining dams and irrigation canals. And this is a very prominent role, as in the United States, part of this is undertaken by the US Army Corps of Engineers. This could be done by the LNA in the east and by the Libyan army and the militias in the west. And this brings me to security. In the east, the picture is a quite cohesive one. The Libyan National Army is more or less in control of the security system in Libya's northeast, in the northern Cyrenaica. This means the Ministry of Interior, with the Undersecretary of State, Faraj Hashim, who is operating over there, has a tight control over security. One may debate if they are too harsh. One may certainly argue that they are jailing numerous innocent people, and that there is even information about torturing in the jails and in the prisons and so on. Nevertheless, I would consider the northern Cyrenaica as reasonably stable. If you go down further to the south, to Kufra and to Fezzan, this is somehow different. The LNA is also present there, and it has, I would say, a control of the major hubs of the major cities. What is the challenge over there is that in many smaller and more remote regions, smaller cities and more remote regions, there are tribal militias, tribal units who are affiliated to the Libyan National Army. So this means, in theory, they belong to the chain of command of the LNA. But this is not really the case all the time. Right now, the LNA has deployed quite a number of crack troops, of elite troops from Cyrenaica to Fezzan to support, as they say, border control towards Niger and towards Algeria. The military leaders in Tripoli are scared that they could be used to occupy the city of Ghadames, with which hopefully in the future open border crossing towards Algeria. I doubt that this is the case, because from a military point, this wouldn't make a lot of sense. For Libya and also for the LNA, the southern border, especially towards Chad and Niger, is the soft belt. The soft belt which might import numerous crises into Libya. And I would assume that the LNA has a certain interest to have this, or to keep this area under control. This is also underlined by the trips of the prime minister in the east, of Prime Minister Hamad, and of one of the sons of Khalifa Haftar, of Southern Haftar, to the neighboring countries in the south, talking and coordinating security along the border. So this is certainly in the interest also of the LNA in order to keep control over this area. Brings us to Tripolitania. In Tripolitania, the picture is much more fragmented. While I would consider Misrata as the safest city in Libya, I would say Zawiya is probably the unsafest city. The reason for this is that the security situation in northern Tripolitania, in the area which is, at least theoretically, under control of the Dabeba government, is extremely fragmented. We have in Tripoli a minister of the interior who hails from the Sintani tribe, who is cooperating very closely with Prime Minister Dabeba, and who tries now to rely on the larger militias, including Radaforce that Jason just mentioned before, to control the city and to get at least the smaller militias out of the city. While this might work in Tripoli itself, we have numerous problems along the coast towards Ras al-Shia, on the border to Tunisia, in Zawiya, in Sabrata, in Ras al-Shia itself, in Abu Kamash. So all these cities are more or less under control of local militias, which is, and this is the interesting point, are all affiliated either to the Ministry of Defense or the Ministry of the Interior, and they are all paid for by the CBL. all paid for by the CBL and loyal to themselves. And this brings me finally to the key role of the CBL. The CBL has, for the time being, as it was mentioned, I think, by Claudia and Farage, also quite a lot of money for reconstruction in the East. If the CBL new leadership is not willing, if they have finally access to the codes, is not willing to continue with this, the East will probably dry out financially. And this will certainly lead to some more severe troubles in Libya.
That's a very good point, Wolfgang, and that was one of the leading questions that I had. It is not just about the central bank and how you run the day-to-day matters of the country and the transactions and the SWIFT and all the stuff. It also has strategic concerns as to the continuation of funding of the construction in Derna and in the mountains in the east. One of the things that I have noticed, and I have been to Derna several times in the last year, is the incredible amount of immigrants that you see in the streets, both in the east and west. I mean, the migration, the movement of people from Africa, the Sahel particularly, is, and I don't know what the numbers are, but I am told that the numbers are in the hundreds of thousands of African migrants. Now with the Sudan crisis, it even has increased significantly. Can you tell us about the borders, Libyan borders, who are basically securing it? Where are the authorities? And of course, this doesn't just become a Libyan security issue. It becomes a European issue, and it becomes a sort of a strategic concern for many countries outside of Libya. What is the status in there, and is there sort of coordination, collaboration between Europeans, Italy particularly, and the Libyans on that matter? We've seen Langley from the AFRICOM that has come in and visited Libya recently. I am pretty sure it isn't. Doesn't have to do with the reconstruction of Derna or so on, more of other sort of strategic interests in the region. Can you comment on that, please? And again, I will ask after that Claudia and Jason to weigh in on this question.
Sure. Well, let's start this time with the Labour government, with Tripolitania. In Tripolitania, there are two components. One is the Libyan Coast Guard, which is more or less securing the shores of the Mediterranean. But there are just two elements of this Coast Guard which can be considered really reliable. The one in Tripoli and the one in Misrata. The other ones are quite questionable units, and a very good example is what happened just yesterday in Savia, where the commanding officer of the Savia Coast Guard, his name is Albija, was murdered when he left one of the barracks in Janzur. Albija was not only the commanding officer of the Naval Academy and of the Coast Guard in Savia, he was also the kingpin of human trafficking from Libya towards Sicily. He was on the list of wanted of the United Nations and of several others. So the Coast Guard outside of Tripoli and of Misrata is highly unreliable. What the Europeans are doing is they are supporting the training of this Coast Guard while being aware that this is not a very easy partner to deal with. With regard to the land borders right now, and I really want to stress right now, the border crossing site from Ras Ashtir to Tunisia is under control of the authorities in Tripoli, of the Ministry of the Interior. This might change in the near future again. It was for almost all the time since 2011 under control of local Amasik militias from the city of Survara. Further down in the mountains, there is a second border crossing site, Wasin the Hiba, which is also under control of the Amasik from the mountains of the Jabal Nafusa. In between, there are some ways and routes which are used by the Sintani smugglers towards Tunisia and further down in the south to Algeria. From the south of Gadames, all along the other border to Egypt, the border is more or less under control of the Libyan National Army and its affiliated units. But I would say further down in the Sahara, especially in the Tibesti Mountains, this is not a really favorable terrain for a strict control of border control. This is next to impossible for the limited capacities of the East to seal off this border. But as we can see, and I'm sure that Claudia can elaborate a little bit more on the Italian Prime Minister and on her visits to Libya, to Benghazi and to Tripoli, Khalifa Haftar has a certain interest in cooperation and in being recognized by the Europeans. And this means this is one component why he is right now, I would say, really after containing illegal migration. Just a couple of days ago, they have raided migration camps in Ashwairif, that's, I would say, in the center west of the Sahara Desert, where they apprehended or freed, depending on the point of view, more than 1,200 illegal migrants. They are really trying to seal off the border to the south. And one of the reasons is certainly that they want to cooperate and they have an interest in cooperation with the Europeans. The other reason is if those people are not able to move on, they are destabilizing their own area. This means Haftar doesn't have a real interest to have 10,000s of migrants on the coast of the Cyrenaica and of the Oil Crescent. And this is the second reason why he tries right now, and I'm very careful about this, to contain migration to a manageable level. With regard to Italy, I'm sure that Claudia Cassini has many more insights than I have.
Thank you. Claudia, do you want to weigh in this, please?
Not particularly. I mean, migration issues is a completely different topic. I thought we were going to just focus more on Derna and the reconstruction issues. So I'll leave this for another conversation.
Okay, so just 2 sentences from my side.
Yeah.
What the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is doing is realpolitik. Realpolitik. She has realized she needs a partner in Tripolitania, just opposite of Sicily, and this is the reason why the Italian government, also before Giorgia Meloni, is dealing with whoever is in charge in Tripoli.
Well, I think the link that I have here is when you walk into the streets of Derna, I have been blown off by the number of migrants that actually live in Derna. Derna is a small city. I mean, it used to be at its best times about 100,000 people in there. It has kind of thinned out after the disaster. And then basically there are those mass projects that are coming in, but also there is a visible, strong visible presence of migrants on the streets of Derna. And it basically brings in the issue of who is going to and how is the demographics of the city going to change as a result of the loose borders, the lucrative construction businesses and so on that are happening in Derna with a very limited population around there. And that is why I look at it from that perspective, not just the construction technical component of it, but the demographic changes that potentially can actually happen in the city. That's why I brought this subject up, Claudia. But there are, everything in Libya is very much entwined. What happens in Zintan has a major effect in the borders of the eastern borders and the south and so on. It's just, everything is so much linked. And I think that bringing back the personal aspect of Derna and the people of Derna and so on, I'm going to ask Hassan, who was born in Derna. He actually grew up, his youth and childhood was there, to give us a little bit of a reflection on how he felt when he went back in Libya recently, about 2 months ago, and saw the city and came back with some ideas about what the human capacity is in the city and what they really need to have in there to rebuild their lives. Hassan?
Thanks, Hani. And thank you all for being here today. Okay, well, as Hani said, I mean, I was born and raised till I finished elementary school. Then I moved to Benghazi to have my high school degree, and then came to the United States 56 years ago or so, maybe more, to study, but then I stayed. And last time, before this last visit to Derna, in 2011, during the uprising, I was there. And the month of October of 2011 was another storm that actually hit Derna, okay, and did some damage, but not to the extent that we see from this storm. But I'm gonna quote here the researchers from Yale University that I'm gonna see whether I have that here in my, okay, the researchers in Yale, they are saying that it was the deadliest single flood event to hit Africa in recorded history. That's not my saying, that's the Yale guys. Okay, it was also regarded as the deadliest storm globally. The effect of this storm, you know, first of all, I think the question comes about what Claudia brought up about master plan. You know, I am a professional engineer in the state of California. That's all what we do, to come up with master plan before we build the house, to see exactly what the house fits in the neighborhood or not. In any case, there is no master plan for building. There is no master plan for the mental health, psychological health that hit the city. When I was in Derna, I met with multiple families, including my own family, which we lost about 20 people in that flood from the Sersi family and our relative. In any case, and our house was completely destroyed. The house that I was born in and lived in was completely destroyed and cannot be rebuilt because it's near the Wadi. I think the question is, were the dams a factor in catastrophe that happened? And the answer is yes. The dams were, because there was more rain. As a matter of fact, 29 inches, about 750 millimeters of rain hit an island in Greece. That's where the whole thing started. The storm started in Greece on September 4th. A week later, it hit Derna, through Benghazi and Marcha and Gabba and Susa and all of that. In any case, so the storm, when it hit, those dams were not designed, okay, for a storm of this nature. They were designed for 150 millimeter annually of rain. That's like 6 inches. 6 inches of rain. I think Arizona is probably the average rainfall in Arizona is similar to this, like 6 inches of rain. And then in California, it's about 14 inches of rain we see here on the average. Okay, there are times when it's more, when there's times when it's less, and we have a drought and all of that. But in any case, Derna was not and will not qualify for dams. And the reason, I lived in 1955, there was and I was only like 12 years old at the time. 1955, we had a big storm, and we had, and the loss of lives were minimal. Were like maybe 10 people passed away. Maybe there was a cow or a donkey or whatever that was, with the current of the Wadi. The Wadi is supposed to be an open field for the water to flow from the mountains to the sea. They obviously, in my opinion, it was the wrong decision in the 1977 when they built those dams. And I am really, really, really pushing for no dams in Derna. We don't need dams. We need to think intelligently, okay, and how to build Derna. As a master plan, there are so many now, even in California, we have 5 dams that were actually 5 dams in the state of California in the United States that have been removed. There are 3 dams in India, that were built 10 years ago with the same thing like earth dams, not concrete dams. 3 of them. 2 of them actually failed after 10 years of their life, failed in India. Okay, 1 of them survived, the other 2 failed, and 10,000 people died in that thing. So we see storms, we cannot control the storm, but we should be intelligent enough to manage a storm. And I think they are not, Faraj, you said something about construction and all of that stuff. That's all good. But what I saw in Derna when I visited a few months ago, the psychological impact on people is tremendous. I know a guy of my age that I was sitting with in a coffee shop, and the rain started to fall. And he said, you know, Hassan, I get now nervous, afraid of rain. To the extent, imagine if a man of my age is afraid of having rain because he thinks of the storm, that there may be a storm like that. This storm is a 300, what they call 300-year storm. 300 meaning it could happen again. And there is a storm forming right now, and it's actually moving toward Libya. So there is a storm from the Indian side, the Indian Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, from that side, that it's gonna hit again almost at the same time as last year's storm. So in my opinion, you know, when I came out of Derna, I had a colleague of mine by the name of Hamdi Burwa. And I told him, Hamdi, I'm a designer, I'm a builder, I'm a thinker, but I cannot help build Derna unless I have a master plan. And therefore, the only thing I could help with is to what I saw from the refugees and also from kids that are living with their uncles and aunts and all of that stuff, that they are complaining about having them because it's a responsibility. That I thought of the only thing I could help with is to design, which I did with the help of an architect in Egypt from Derna as well, Hilmi Sofrakis, that the two of us came up with a design of a village for the orphanage, for orphans that are, okay, and I have submitted to the Libyan government in Benghazi. Okay, till today, I did not hear yay or nay. I did not hear from, and therefore for me, it's an A. But I think here is, Faraj, if you could help me with this, being in Benghazi, please. You know, Claudia said that she went to the Mansour said, and it's still in ruins. And we want it to be cleaned, that area, but not to rebuild another set, because if this storm hit again, regardless of what said, they claim it's negligence. Yes, even if it was repaired, even it would not have resisted the amount of water. Okay, and water is like 64 pounds per square inch. 64. That's a lot of force that hit anything. And imagine that Hani hit me, okay, and I get injured, okay. But if our colonel hit me, I may fall down, okay, because of the amount of force that he would exerted on me. As an engineer, okay, I have done so many in my lifetime, for 50 or 60 years of my engineering and professional engineering time, and you know, by the way, I was part of a review team that did 6 dams in Wadi Jofra, in between the south and Tripoli. I was one of the reviewers. Okay, they were all built from concrete. These 2 dams were built from earth fill. So the earth fill would not resist anything, and therefore, as Wolfgang said, I agree with him. The dams are not the cause; people are the cause.
So, from what I'm gathering, and thank you, Hassan, for your insight on this. From what I'm gathering from the speakers today, is that there is really sort of a lack of expertise or detailed views, analysis, and opinion on and a clear vision on how to move forward with the city, other than the structures of the bridges and some of the infrastructure that was put in. And we did see that there were some schools that were rebuilt, hospitals that were reconstructed, and these are all positive things. And whatever authority is there doing this work is perceived positively by the people of city, but there are still some gaps here and there. There is a sense that experts are not there to share their opinion on the future of the city. There is a sense of deficits here and there that could be actually useful in leading the way towards a sort of more appropriate city building, urban planning, looking at the dams and what the future of water control in the city. We've also heard about mental health, and the National Council has actually been engaged in the issue of mental health, particularly in children in Derna. And we have teamed up with American and local teams and looked at school children. And the analysis that we had made there were actually shocking in that when we did surveys of those kids at school, kids in Derna, we find that the prevalence of what they call high category risk of mental illness as a result of the dam collapse and the flood, kids losing their families, experiencing that shocking experience and so on. The amount of high level damage that was identified in those surveys were reported to be higher than any other disaster in the world, neither in Hawaii or in the earthquake in Turkey or other places had actually produced that amount of child mental illness. So those are all issues that need to be tackled and to be brought into the vision of where to go from there in Derna. I do want to, there's no Libya without international engagement. I mean, whether we like it or not, the internationals have been engaged from the first day one, from the regime change that occurred in 2011 and on. And Libyans really look out and up to what the philosophy of the policies of the U.S., the Europeans, and so on, and how, and Turkey and Egypt, and how they are engaged in shaping up the future of Libya from every point, from security, politics, economics, and so on. And I want to bring this back to Jason. You've followed this. You've wrote about the global disorder. You wrote about the interest or disinterest in what is happening in Libya. You've seen that there are some real politics that are happening in Libya today, meaning that there is a sort of an evolution of, forget about elections. That's a challenge. But there are real politics. There a military regime in the east, and there is what is happening in Tripoli. Can you tell us about, and then there's the Russians, there's the Chinese, there's African maps, there's BRICS, all this stuff happening around us. How likely, in your opinion, is the United States and the international effectors willing to play a serious role for a positive change in Libya today? Is this kind of a no man's land and stay away from it? There's so many things happening. Can you tell us a little bit about this? Because ultimately, that kind of higher international blanket impacts at a micro level what is going to be happening in Derna and Benghazi and other disaster areas.
Mm-hmm. On the one hand, I agree with part of the premise of the question. On the other, I disagree with some of the framing. Yes, of course, the internationals are critical to, for example, delivering food aid or having some kind of coherent approach to an engineering survey relating to Derna. But to go back to my earlier point, the tragedy of the floods was so pronounced, but it was not enough to transcend entropy on the Libya file, nor to enable popular Libyan mobilization against embedded status quo elites. So you referenced a geostrategic threat of Russia in the Sahel. Yes, the Russians have taken over a lot of Sahelian regimes through coup d'etat and through the use of their security services via the post-Wagner group in those regimes. But that is not sufficient to transcend the divisions within the EU between a Russian approach and an Italian approach, a German approach and a Brussels approach. So it's not possible right now until after the conclusion of the war in Ukraine, or depending on how the US electoral cycle plays out, for the disordering aspects on the international scene to present impossible hurdles in collective action to a coherent approach to Libya. So that's just where we are. And we need to call a spade a spade. So it doesn't matter who is going to be head of UNSMIL, or to what extent there are going to be more Russian troop movements or illegal gold mining in Sudan or Chad. Those things will not be sufficient to transcend the current entropy.
Thank you, Jason. I am going to ask a sort of a general question. And you may say that, oh, it doesn't have to do with Derna, but in many ways it has to do with Derna. And this is a sort of a general question for all the speakers. Libya is in a chaotic state right now. It is divided, de facto divided. Do you envision Libya as a united country in the future, a united federal country, a confederation, or separate states in the 10 to 20 years from now? Claudia, I'm going to have you answer this question first. What are your thoughts on where the country is heading?
I will answer your question, but I first want to say something on Derna because we haven't mentioned this issue and I think it's very important. So I would feel very bad closing the session without mentioning this. How many people died? Do you know?
It's a very good question. We still don't.
Some publications say 5,000, some publications say 10,000. There was an estimate of more than 10,000. I tried during my last 2 visits to Derna to actually find a death toll. There is no final death toll. We have figures of people who have been buried with official documents, and I'm looking at the figures here, 1,500. We have people who have been buried without permissions, 900. We have, from the prosecutor's office, 3,600 missing files. That comes up to 6,129 as a tentative total from the prosecutor's office. But we also have books published by Libyans that have done a death toll based on interviewing the families of Derna, and they come up with a completely different death toll, which is 11,000, right? So I'm really troubled that 1 year after the disaster, you Libyans, Dernawis, don't actually know what the final figure is. And I think that's another issue that warrants attention. It should be a very simple thing, but we don't have that figure, and I find that's very sad. So looking forward, I hope local authorities are able to sort that out. So you asked me, where's Libya going? I mean, in a certain sense, if you can't come up with a death toll.
But before you do this, you are absolutely right. And it actually is a sign of the decay of institutions in a city like Derna. You would have think that a question like this would be immediately picked up by the University of Derna. You know, there's academics that are, hey, how many have we actually lost? It isn't just about the government. It's, governments are, effective facilitators. But the truth is, there are several other institutions that can weigh into a question like this and then build up a consensus. It may not be accurate scientifically, but at least come up with a really better detailed report than what we have right now floating around with no answer to this. 100%, I totally agree with you.
I would push back, though, because we're not going to have a correct death toll in Ukraine. We're not going to have a death toll for the Kursk offensive, the Ukrainian push into Russia. We certainly don't have a correct death toll in Gaza. Do you know what I mean? So I just would say, given that Libya has a much higher degree of dysfunction than the Ukrainian state or even Hamas's health ministry, I'm not sure that it would be reasonable to expect a proper death toll.
Very good.
May I answer you, Claudia? I know when I was in Derna, the estimate was like 5,600 known deaths, 8,000 missing. I have family members that are missing. We declared them they're missing and they're not returning. It's been a year and they have not returned. those 8,000. So what do you consider that? So the estimate of 11 to 12,000 is accurate to me. That's how many people.
These are the figures of the prosecutor's office. So
Yeah.
officially, the prosecutor office represents the state, right?
Yeah, that's
So
basically,
this is the figure of Libyans. You have to add 400. So I'm just saying that it's paradoxical that the interpretations range so widely. You know, are they 8,000 missing, or is it just the 3,000 who have open files, missing people's files? And I think it should be a simple thing, you know. I mean, Hamas in Gaza issues statements every day saying what is their final death toll, their estimate on the basis of their things. In Libya, this is not, it hasn't even been possible, and it's not under siege, and they're not under war, and people are going to their offices. And as you said, Hani, they're academics, there are other offices, there's a civil registry, there's a parliament, there's so many authorities that could be doing this sort of final fine-tuning.
put this to a closure, because every war, every tragedy, and so on, ultimately, at a certain period of time passing, they should come up with some sort of a conclusion, whether it is accurate or inaccurate. Like Jason states, there has to be a sort of a more serious effort in at least making a conclusion, including limitations to the study, which should be included in that study. I'm going to go back again because we only have a few minutes in there, and I want to hear the experts on this. How do you envision Libya? A united country? Years time for now. Claudia, and then Jason, and then
2 cents worth, whatever it's worth. I mean, you know, facts on the ground are so rapidly changing that the Libya we know today might not be the Libya we know tomorrow, but I would say somehow it'll be hanging together in a very dysfunctional way, as it has been.
Wolfgang?
I'll side with Claudia here. I agree. The entropy on the international stage makes it possible for status quo actors to outflank initiatives to change things. Status quo actors have kept Libya in this dysfunctional state where they can benefit from access to pots of money, semi-sovereign institutions, militia backers. They don't need to have a profound change or a federal state or a confederation. That would require a lot of change. But the answer is going to come from the war in Ukraine and the US presidential election, and not from dynamics of one militia controlling one street or not in Tripoli. I have to run. I have another call. Nice seeing everyone. Have a great Labor Day. Bye.
Jason, Faraj, can you comment on this one? Faraj? Faraj, are you still with us?
Yeah, he's here. Is he
Can you
muted?
hear me?
Mute, please.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
go ahead.
well, I beg to differ from what Jason said. I didn't think the American elections or the war in Ukraine or whatever has anything to do with us in Libya here. Libya here, we've been brutalized. We've had a rough time. Now we've got our own destiny. We're designing our own future. I think the way that we are going to go, the current confederacy will carry on for maybe 5-10 years. I don't know, until we can come back to our senses, and then maybe we can have a federated state for a number of years until the current phases disappear, and then we leave it to the new generations to design or to agree a government system that's suitable for them then, not now. But meanwhile, we are just concerned with restoring our pride, having some sort of development, and picking ourselves up from the mess that we have put ourselves in, and no one will have any say in the way that we design our future. We will have our own say in how Libya to be and to be governed as well.
Wolfgang?
Well, I've said already since about almost 10 years, at the latest in 2032, but probably already in 2030, Libya will be either a federation or broken up after a very bloody civil war. It's of course up to the Libyans to decide how to get there. I would recommend to get there through legitimacy, using the current HCS initiative about the new government, and by voting about the new prime minister under the attendance of the UN Special Representative and several ambassadors after a public hearing, and after the HCS agreed to each and every candidate. It is to be voted for by the HOR. And this prime minister should lead the country to elections. And I would say, finally, people like, for example, the businessman Mohammed al-Masougi might be acceptable for many Libyans. It's not necessary to elect one of the more controversial ones. There should be also people who are more acceptable to many.
Very specific opinions. Thank you very much, everybody, for a wonderful conversation today. We all hope that Derna will prosper and stabilize, and for the people of Derna to have a better means of life and future. I personally will be in Derna in about a week from now, and we will continue to follow the progress of that part of the country. Thank you again for your insight on everything that we discussed today. And you have a great,
Thank you.
Thank you, and happy Labor Day, by the way. Take care, everybody.
Bye.